Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Glad you're back with me. And we're going to continue reading in our book, Escape Down the Raging Rapids. This is the last book in the DJ Dillon Adventure Series by Lee Roddy. So we're on chapter 3. Yesterday, as DJ and Alfred were trying to get down where the rafters were so that hopefully they could get away from that fire and to safety, they were spotted by two people when DJ had got a funny feeling that something he could hear. So the two people, the ones that had burnt that cabin down, Tobin and Odell, saw them. And they're trying to beat the boys down to the raft. And he says, we could shove off with the rafters before those two get there. For their sakes, I hope they do, Tobin said grimly. He has evil plans. Chapter 3, A Boy's Terrible Longing. DJ was glad when he and Alfred started around the last curve of the forest trail leading down the canyon to Mad River. They'd been here before with their fellow campers, so the boys realized they were getting close. That made DJ's heart speed up with hope. We're almost there, he called over his shoulder to Alfred, who was walking a few steps behind in the narrow Forest Service trail. Then we'd better take off these handkerchiefs. We don't want to come out of the woods looking like a couple of bandits. I just hope they're still there, DJ replied, removing his handkerchief from his face. The cloth was dry now, but it wasn't needed the same way it was before. The smoke and fires were falling behind them as the boys eased down the mountain into the river canyon. DJ was still fighting mixed emotions. The guilt seemed heavier now. He thought, if I hadn't been careless yesterday, I wouldn't have forgotten my sweater when we stopped for lunch. And this morning, I didn't follow the rules either. We shouldn't have left camp without getting permission from the counselor. Then he defended himself. But how could we have known the wind was going to change and make the fires cut us off? Trying to ease his own conscience didn't help much, especially now that he'd made matters worse by being bitten by a flea. DJ wondered if the deadly black plague germs were starting to work inside his body. He wasn't quite so worried about the fires anymore because they were falling very well behind, though still moving this way. The boy's mind jumped to his parents. They'd probably be frantic with worry about now. They must think I'm dead, DJ told himself, and Alfred too. That thought made him feel even guiltier. So he tried to switch his thinking. Hope Grandpa's okay. I miss him. The boy thought a moment, then added, Dad too. Something stiff and distant stood between him and his father. There was never the same warm, good feelings as existed between Grandpa and DJ. DJ had once asked to Mom when she was patching his jeans, why doesn't Dad love me? Why, David Jonathan Dillon, his stepmother had exclaimed. Whatever gave you that silly idea? He never says it, that's why. Your father's not the kind of man to show much emotion, DJ, but that doesn't mean he doesn't love you. Sometimes, Two Mom said with a sigh, had a sigh a little and gone on with her sewing. DJ had an idea Two Mom would have liked to hear the words more often from her husband too. The one thing in this world DJ wanted was his father to show he really loved him. To say it in plain English was a terrible longing that hurt deep down inside. Alfred broke into his thoughts. I hear the rapids. We're getting close now. I hear them too, DJ replied. He was anxious to see if the rafters were still there. He'd learned yesterday that this was a staging area, or initial launch point for a trip, called a put-in. Everything was carried on mules and horseback. The rafters had walked in. It would take them a full day to get their rafts inflated and the gear stowed. There was a good chance the people wouldn't have shoved off yet. Maybe there's a doctor among them, maybe. Or maybe not. DJ tried not to think of that, or the deadly plague germs possibly starting to build in his body. He forced his thoughts to stay away from the terrible idea and back to his whole adventure that he'd started. At church in the last few weeks, Brother Paul had urged parents to send their kids to youth camp. Some families in the little logging community of Stone Ridge didn't have cars or pickups that would climb up the steep mountain roads. So Brother Paul had driven with a carload of kids when the camp opened. Kathy, his daughter, had wanted to attend, but she got a serious case of the flu the night before and had to stay home. Brother Paul had promised to return when camp ended and drive the same kids back to Stony Ridge. DJ said to Alfred, I'm sure Kathy's all right now, and I imagine she and her father at camp picking up kids. Brother Paul's probably talking to Dad about you and me too. DJ was partly right. Brother Paul, assisted by DJ's father, was loading the last of 4 kids, their camping gear, into his car. Kathy had stayed home with her mother to leave more room in the car for the kids returning from camp. Well, Sam, the lay preacher rumbled as he carefully closed the car door. The kids inside were strangely quiet. Everyone's gone but you and me. I've got these young'uns to get home. You coming? I'm going to send Hannah home with Pris, but I'll stay here as long as I can. Since they've ordered the camp evacuation, that probably won't be much longer. Maybe it'll be long enough. I keep hoping there'll be some news, or the boys will come walking out of the mountains. I'm right sorry to leave you like this, Sam, but these young people's folks will be fretting about their safety. But before I go, I'd like to pray with you. Brother Paul reached out and laid a big hand on the other man's shoulder. Dad Dillon bowed his head while the lay preacher prayed quietly but fervently. When he had finished, Dad Dillon echoed the lay pastor's amen. They walked around the back of the car filled with young campers. Paul, something's been bothering me for a long time. What's that, Sam? Dad Dillon hesitated. It was obviously very hard for him to say what was on his mind. Paul, do you ever tell your daughter that you love her? Almost every day. It's important for Kathy to know how her mother and I feel about her. But doesn't she know by the way you act? The big man sensed something behind Sam Dillon's words. Brother Paul thought for a moment before answering. No, she doesn't. Nobody does, really. Love is not something you do. It's something you say. Well, I think it's actually both. Dad Dillon didn't answer. He looked towards the fires. The big preacher's face changed slightly as he seemed to understand what was troubling the powerfully built logger. You never told DJ you loved him, have you? Dad Dillon lowered his eyes to stare unseeingly at the ground, but he did not speak. Brother Paul's voice was barely a whisper, but it came out with a deep bass sound that seemed to make the ground tremble a little. Sam, did I ever tell you the story about my father's death? Dad Dillon looked up in surprise, wondering what this had to do with the present situation. No, I don't think so. Remind me sometime. It may help you. Well, I've got to get these kids out of here. Call me when you get home, or if I can do anything. Tomorrow the whole church will pray for DJ and Alfred and your families. Will you be there? I don't rightly know yet, Paul. I'm going to make one last check of the office before having Hannah drive Chris home. The two men shook hands. In a moment, Brother Paul's sedan was moving out of the camp, leaving only the Dillons' car and a few official vehicles. There was a terrible loneliness about the place. Only the wind moaned softly in the tall pines. Dad Dillon walked rapidly towards his wife and stepdaughter. DJ's a smart boy, the father thought, trying to comfort himself. So's Alfred. When they got caught off from the camp, they must have headed for Mad River. They'll be safe there until the fire burns out. Miles away, DJ and Alfred finished rounding the final curve in the forest. DJ's anxious blue eyes probed ahead, straining to see through the last of the trees to the river where the rafters would be. Alfred moved to walk beside DJ as the trail widened, and they came even with the last stands of the trees. Both boys were breathing hard, partly from running and partly from excitement and hope. They stepped out of the sheltering woods and gazed upon an acre or so of gravel, with the river beyond. Steep granite cliffs rose sharply on the far side of the river. DJ let out a happy yelp. "Look, they're still here!" Alfred grinned broadly. "Sure are. We made it. Let's hope there's a doctor among them." The boys ran across the open gravel bar, squinting against the sun's glare off the white rocks. The river was in front of them was wide, quiet and deep through the rapids, though the rapids could be heard upstream. Great boulders the size of 2 car garages stuck up out of the river. They looked like giant prehistoric dinosaur bones whitened by the sun. The water was so clear the rocky bottom was visible. Alfred puffed with the sound of the stones under his feet. "Are you going to tell them about the flea bite?" "Not unless I have to. First, I'm going to see if one of them is a doctor or nurse. If not, I'll ask if anyone's got a CB radio or a walkie-talkie or some way of signaling an air tanker or a helicopter if one flies over. If they contact a helicopter by radio, maybe it can land and pick you up," Alfred said hopefully. "It'll take you right to the doctor, and maybe you could even get a message to our parents. I haven't seen any choppers or planes in the last half hour or so. Maybe they had to land because it was too dangerous to fly anymore today. If none of those plans work, then what? Maybe we'll get a ride downriver with the rafters. They could let me off at the first town. Hey, they've seen us. Everybody's looking over here. I count 8 people, including 2 women and a girl about our age. Look, they're waving. All but 2 of the people near the 2 beached rafts waved to the approaching boys, but Tobin and Odell, they stood a few feet beyond the second raft, watching uneasily. Tobin muttered, "So same 2 kids. The one without the glasses saw us burn down that house." Tobin had no idea that he had the boys mixed up because Alfred had to remove his glasses to clean them when Tobin saw him. Odell prompted, "Hey, I didn't burn it." "You're just as guilty as I am. We both broke into that place. Anyway, I'm not going to let them send me back to that kids' jail. Now, how are you going to avoid it, Mr. Smarty?" "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. Then those kids will wish they had never come here." So, That's the end of that story. And tomorrow we'll find out how that turns out going for the kids. I hope it turns out okay. And I'm glad that Dad Dylan talked to Brother Paul about saying, I love you, and how important that is. You know, years ago, I decided to tell my dad I loved him because my dad did not say that. Oh, I knew he loved me. There was no doubt in my mind. He worked very hard. He was friendly to me. He was very loving to me. He made wonderful waffles on Sunday mornings, and we would have a lot of fun that way. But he didn't really tell me he loved me. And because of that, I didn't really tell him either. But as a young adult, it dawned on me, hey, knock that off. It's important to say when you love somebody. So I called up my dad and told him. And I was glad I did. And after that, we could both say it to each other. Although Dad still didn't say a lot, but once in a while. And I'm thankful for that. So you try to, maybe even today, tell somebody that you love them. Tell several people. The most important person to tell is God, because He's provided us with everything. Well, I'm going to quit talking for now. I love you. I really do. I'm praying for blessings for you and those in your house, when you're inside and outside in the day and the night. Whatever you do, keep dreaming. Keep a story in your heart. Good night.